Overcoming by Pure Voice Girl. Chapter 49.
What is this one, Hannibal?
Something was thrust in his face, prickly leaves tickling his nose, and Hannibal sniffed, filling his lungs with the scent of fresh-cut herbs.
Rosemary!
He cried, eyes flying open to find her crying.
Chiyoh?
Someone called her name, sharp and impatient, an adult with urgent business who had no time for childish needs.
I have to go away,
she told him, another tear rolling down her smooth face.
He's sending me away.
She flung her arms around him in a brief short hug, bony arms, a crush of sweet floral scent, the herbal aroma of her heavy dark hair, and suddenly she was gone. Her long braids streamed out behind her, skirts kicking up around her stick-thin calves, her bare feet black on the bottoms from the garden's rich, deep earth.
Chiyoh!
Hannibal cried, giving chase but unable to keep up with her, a clumsy fawn behind a nimble doe.
Chiyoh, come back!
She looked back over her shoulder, but she didn't slow, her dark eyes full of loss as she raced through the gardens of Galley Field, heeding that impatient voice.
Chiyoh, come back!
The little girl he had once known stood before him as a grown woman, composed and still, but smiling. Her age didn't show on her as his own did, he saw. She looked no older than Will, though she was older than Hannibal himself. Yet he could see the echoes of the child who had played games with him in the garden, recognizing what he had once forgotten, her face rising up through the veil of his past to tease him with formless memories. "Hannibal?" Will softly questioned, moving to his side to grasp his hand. The strange bittersweet sadness he felt through his bond bewildered him as much as Hannibal's recognition of the stranger before them. Chiyoh, he had called her, as if she'd once been an intimate acquaintance of his. But why on earth would an intimate acquaintance come in through the servants' entrance? "Pardon me for surprising you," Chiyoh said, her voice measured and even. "It has been a very long time, I know." "Gods," Hannibal breathed, his fingers clenching on Will's, amber eyes widening with disbelief even as a smile curled the corner of his lips. "Is it really you?" She dipped her head in a nod, her own smile slight but genuine. "Hannibal?" Will said again, and his mate shook himself, drawing Will's hand to his lips for a quick, soothing kiss. "Forgive me, Will," Hannibal said, drawing a shaky breath. "This is Chiyoh. I knew her when I was a child at Galley Field. She lived with us there when I was very young." He gazed at her with a softness in his eyes that was more and more at home there. "How long has it been?" Hannibal asked, his thumb moving over Will's fingers, smoothing his soft skin. 30 years?
31,
she answered, still as a statue, as if awaiting something, some reaction or word that would somehow mend a separation that spanned decades. "You both must have been very young," Will said, surprised. Despite his earlier teasing, it struck him suddenly how much distance there was between himself and Hannibal in their ages. 30 years ago, Hannibal had known this woman as a child, while Will hadn't even been hoped for yet. Will's good breeding took over in this moment of confoundment, and he tugged Hannibal towards the settee, urging, "Shall we sit?" "Yes, of course, where are my manners?" Hannibal said, the words a breathless rush offered with a smile. "Chiyoh, this is my mate, Will."
"We've met,"
Chiyoh said, sliding gracefully to sit with the packet in her lap. "She's come with the journal translation," Will said, settling at Hannibal's side, uncertain what to make of her reserve. When his husband merely shook his head, Will reminded him, "Lady Murasaki's journal." "Gods, I'd nearly forgotten," Hannibal breathed, dread casting a pall over the pleasure he'd first felt. "How on earth did you get involved?" Chiyoh spread her long fingers over the package in her lap, smoothing the edges, and said, "Some time ago her journal was brought to our community to be translated. The man who began the translation recognized the mentions of me and asked if I would finish it in his place." "Her journal," Hannibal murmured, fingers still tightly entwined with Will's. "Of course you would be mentioned." "Are you here to deliver it?" Will asked, eyeing the package with curiosity. "Yes," she said, her mouth pursing in a soft frown. "When I was told who it was for, I decided I would bring it in person." Her dark eyes sought Hannibal's and held them, a soft plea in their depths.
I know you have forgotten me, but I have never forgotten you, Hannibal. I wish to see you again. I wish to make certain that her story is safe in your hands."
Hannibal swallowed hard, oddly moved by her request, wondering how he could have forgotten so much about his childhood and the people who had been a part of it. "I know my husband's relationship with the Lady Murasaki was not all it could be," Will gently reassured her. "But it will be in good hands. I think there is a great deal that has been lost with time where she is concerned, and we could all benefit greatly to know it once more." Chiyo's eyes flicked to Will's, quietly assessing, measuring, but not malicious or unkind, only cautious. "Yes," she said, smoothing her palm over the packet.
"There is a great deal that has been lost. It is very important to me that she is remembered well, Hannibal. She died in a place far from her home, and she is buried in the earth surrounded by those who did not love her. I could do nothing to ease her burden while she lived, but this I can do. This I can do. And perhaps the debt I owe her can finally be paid."
"Debt?" Hannibal asked, curious despite himself, his heart giving a strange little lurch when he thought of the Omega who had raised him, the pain half resentment, half heartbreak.
"I was orphaned in war, the only survivor of our compound, the child of a serving girl,"
Chiyoh slowly said, her careful words slow and considered, not a single syllable wasted.
"Lady Murasaki was a soldier, the warlord after her father."
"An Omegan warlord?" Will asked, fascinated.
"It is the custom in Nippon,"
Chiyoh said, and corrected herself with a small, sad smile.
"It was the custom. The mingling of male and female is a sign of favor, lucky. Armies were always led by Omegan generals, and men always prayed for an Omegan child to leave their legacy to."
"Not sons?" Hannibal asked, intrigued despite himself to hear her speak of things he had no knowledge of.
"If there were no Omegan children," Chiyoh conceded, "but they were preferred. In the end, children are only currency that lasts. What better investment than an heir who can both bear and sire them?"
"You said you were taken away as a child. Did you learn this from her?"
"From Lady Murasaki at first. Later, from the community where I grew up. There was a terrible war in our homeland, and many of us fled. Lady Murasaki should have abandoned me to die, but she took me instead. When the uprising left our world in ruin and foreigners came to our lands, she left everything behind to bring me with her."
"She brought you to the continent first, didn't she?" Will asked, her words astonishing him, his vivid imagination seizing on the images she evoked and capturing his curiosity in a heartbeat. "I don't understand, Chiyoh," Hannibal said, bewilderment wrinkling his brow. "How did you end up with the journal? Rather, how did you end up in the capital in order to get the journal? Is that where they took you?" "Took her?" Will echoed, glancing up from Hannibal to Chiyoh, whose dark eyes slid to her lap, hidden behind the fan of her lashes. My only memory of Chiyoh is of her telling me she had to leave," Hannibal said, watching her carefully for any sign of emotion on her smooth face. "He's sending me away, you said?"
"Yes,"
Chiyoh whispered, still looking at her hands in her lap.
"I was sent away, apprenticed to a craftsman, hidden in a community of people from my homeland. It was a punishment, but not for me. He wanted to send me away from her. He wanted to send me home, but there was no home to be sent to."
"So he shipped you off to the capital. You couldn't have been any older than Hannibal. Who would do such a terrible thing to a child?" "My father. It was him, wasn't it? He's the one who sent you off, packed away to the capital to be forgotten among strangers."
"Lady Murasaki wanted to leave him,"
Chiyoh said, her lashes lifting to reveal deep sorrow in her glimmering brown eyes.
"He made sure that she couldn't."
"My gods," Will breathed, paling, stricken with horror. "He used you as a pawn to keep her at his side."
"I always thought she had sent me away,"
Chiyoh admitted, cradling the journal itself as if it was the most fragile, precious item in the world.
"But now I know differently."
She met Hannibal's gaze, holding it with firm determination.
"Now you
will know differently too." Hannibal said nothing for a long moment, his eyes closing in mingled dread and fear. But Will's fingers moved in his, a light clasp of touch, and his warm, sweet scent filled Hannibal's lungs, and he knew that he did have the strength to face whatever secrets that translation may hold. He might not have a year ago, pompous and willfully ignorant man that he'd been, but at Will's side there was very little he found impossible, very little he lacked the bravery to face. The monster in that journal was nothing compared to the monster he'd faced in the mirror. "Do you need a moment to speak in private?" Will quietly offered, attuned to his turmoil, less the bond and more his perceptive nature.
"No, please stay,"
Hannibal said, fingers tightening on Will's own. He opened his eyes and found Chiyoh watching him, silently reserved, ever watchful, and still waiting for something he couldn't fathom.
"You heard how she died?"
"Yes," she said, the barest flash of pain flitting across her face before fading away. "The man I was apprenticed to told me. He said she was buried here, and I cried when I heard it. As long as I knew her, Lady Murasaki only wanted to return home."
"But there was no home to return to,"
Will echoed, saddened.
"No. The world we knew was gone. The riches of her house stolen, the tenants of her lands murdered in their villages. Her heart longed for a place that no longer was, and now her spirit is left to search for it,"
Chiyoh whispered. She patted the packet, saying,
"She can tell you for herself, if you wish to read it."
"Of course I do,"
Hannibal said, a slight shiver coursing through him as the ghostly fingers of his dreams came to rest on his shoulders.
"Perhaps then I will understand why she could never love me, and why I hated her in return."
Chiyoh's brow slid down in a slight frown, and she said,
"She always loved you, Hannibal, but it was not allowed. So she tried to give you strength instead, in place of the love he denied you both."
It took Will as much by surprise as it took Hannibal. They sat before her in stunned silence, eyes wide and unblinking, their laced fingers tightening in response. Chiyoh grasped the packet with both hands, contemplating a moment before she offered it to Will.
"Lady Murasaki used to say all sorrows can be borne if you put them in a story,"
she told them, reluctantly committing the packet to his hands.
"This story is all that remains of her life. It was rarely kind to her, and she was raised as warriors are raised, hard and harsh and impassive. Her life was spent in loss and regret, and like a wild beast she gnashed her teeth against the bars that held her. Do not judge her too harshly. Pain makes monsters of us all."
Will took the packet with grave reserve, settling it into his lap.
"You must stay with us,"
Hannibal said, wrapping his fingers over Will's knee, needing to keep contact with him, the touch grounding him in Will's strength.
"I cannot stay in this house,"
Chiyoh said, her smile sad but tender.
"Your grandfather would dislike it. I would remind him too much he would rather forget, or has already forgotten. I will return to the capital tonight."
"Must you?"
Hannibal asked, loosing a low, embarrassed laugh, unable to meet her gaze.
"So many years since we've seen one another, and you will vanish again."
"I have always been where you can find me, Hannibal,"
Chiyoh told him, no trace of condemnation in her voice, only affection.
"When you are ready to find me. Until then, I am content where I am."
"Please, if we cannot prevail upon you to stay here at the house," Will said, the packet heavy in his hands, the dusty scent of the journal rising up to his sensitive nose, "might we persuade you to stay in Hertford Town? I have your translation fee as well as the box I was given for surety. I can have it brought to you there." She considered it, her reluctance obvious, but Will saw beneath the surface. She doubted her welcome, was uncertain how much she could depend on with the parting they'd had and the past they'd shared. "There must be so much for you two to reminisce about," Will coaxed, hoping she would agree. "At least spend the night. We will cover the cost of your stay. Perhaps we might take you to visit her grave." Her brown eyes widened, a minuscule indication of how profoundly that offer moved her.
"Yes, you must stay,"
Hannibal said, seizing on Will's offer with both hands, determined that Chiyoh would not flee from him, not again.
"We will visit her grave and speak of our lives at Galleyfield. Please, Chiyoh."
"I will stay,"
she said, strangely embarrassed to accept. "I will pay for it, however. I am not here to take advantage of you, Hannibal." Hannibal drew up, affronted by such a suggestion, and said,
"Certainly you aren't. I never dreamed such a thing. But you are here because of a task we set you, albeit unknowingly. You must allow us to compensate you and care for you as a guest, even if you refuse to stay here in the house."
The taut, still surface of her expression rippled, the barest shimmer of relief showing beneath, all but swallowed by her poise. She rose, dipping her head in a slight nod at them both, and said, "Thank you, Hannibal, and thank you, Will. I will stay for a time in town." Hannibal and Will shot to their feet the moment she stood, and Hannibal took her hand to give it a warm kiss, breathing,
"It is very good to see you, Chiyoh."
"I was not sure I would find welcome,"
she said, her voice soft and low.
"I watched you grow, but always from a distance, always holding my silence for fear that you would not know me should I speak. I am very glad to see you again, Hannibal."
She pulled away and went to the door, going as silently as she'd come, leaving behind her the journal, the translation, and one very torn, unhappy Alpha. Will ordered their private breakfast to the study instead of his sitting room, giving Hannibal time to gather himself. A quick check with Mr. Hawkes confirmed that a footman had accompanied Chiyoh down to Hertford Town and would see to the details on their behalf. He also graciously agreed not to mention their visitor to grandfather, as Will wished to tell him with Hannibal. He busied himself pouring coffee for them both before settling back down at Hannibal's side, the packet resting between them with the journal atop it.
"I feel murky bits of memory rising up in the darkness of my mind,"
Hannibal murmured, taking his coffee with a grateful smile. He sipped it, still unused to the strong flavor, and said,
"They shimmer beneath the surface like shards of a mirror in muddy waters, only catching the light by chance, only hinting at what lies beneath."
"What do they hint at, Hannibal?" Will asked, quietly preparing a plate for each of them. He was relieved to find there wasn't a single strong-smelling food on the tray, though his hypersensitive nose found the sweet tart aroma of rhubarb jam somewhat cloying. He pushed it to the far end of the tray and stuck to butter on toast, a safe bet on any day.
"I remember her voice,"
Hannibal said, turning his head just slightly to lift his amber eyes to Will's.
"Chiyoh's voice. I remember her playing a guessing game with me in the garden. Rosemary, thyme, lemon balm. She taught me to recognize the things my nose told me, and envied my alpha senses."
"You were barely out of babyhood when she left," Will murmured, urging his husband to eat. "It isn't surprising you don't remember much."
"Taken,"
Hannibal corrected, a world of unhappiness in that single word.
"He took her away, Will. Rather, he had sent away, all to keep Murasaki at his side. But why?"
"It must be here," Will said, sliding his hands over the packet, his thumb brushing the plain cover of the journal itself. "Her reasons for staying, the things that happened to her, and, in turn, the things that happened to you." Hannibal flinched, dropping his gaze again, prompting Will to gently say, "You said yourself it was strange you could not remember, Hannibal. You must have seen a great deal more than you wished to, or should have. I know it's frightening, and if you would rather not remember—"
"I need to remember,"
Hannibal said, his abrupt words hushing any suggestion to the contrary.
"I just wish I didn't have to."
Will nodded, rubbing his hand down the curve of Hannibal's back in a soothing stroke that pulled a soft, short-lived purr from Hannibal's long throat.
"Everything I was as an adult, everything I believed as a youth,"
Hannibal quietly said, head hanging when Will's hand moved to his nape to squeeze and knead the tight muscles there.
"It was all formed around her, Lady Murasaki."
"It's unsettling, isn't it?" Will murmured, his thoughts turning down the meandering trail of Hannibal's responses. "Thinking that the person you were was based on a lie. But you aren't that man anymore, Hannibal. You aren't the child in her care, or the boy Chiyoh was taken from. You haven't been that person for a very long time."
"But I was,"
Hannibal said, straightening to clasp Will's hand, rubbing his heavy fangs against Will's wrist to comfort himself, all interest in food forgotten.
"I'm afraid I will find out I was wrong all these years, Will. that my hatred of her was as misplaced as my reaction to you when we first met.
If there is that possibility, Will suggested, aware of Hannibal's heartbeat slowing to match his own. He drew on the bond, finding the pain of uncertainty and worry and pulling it to him, drowning it in the contentment of being near to his mate and touched with love. You will not be satisfied to remain ignorant of the truth, Hannibal. You have made your peace with me, with the past we've shared, with the pain you've caused. Hannibal bit him, just a light clasp of heavy teeth against his skin, needing to satisfy the urge Will's delicious scent inspired in him, wanting to calm himself with his mate's tender affection. Don't you think it's time you make your peace with her? Will asked, whispering the words to soften the impact he knew they would have. Hannibal's mouth froze on his skin for a split second, before he pressed a kiss to Will's wrist and lifted his head. It doesn't mean forgiveness, Will reminded him, lowering his hand to take up his cup again. It doesn't even mean understanding her. You see me for who I am. Can't you give her the same chance? Whatever this journal says, the way she raised you influenced your understanding of the world. She damaged you, and knowing her intentions won't change that. Even if you still despise her in the end, at least you will know the truth. Hannibal's amber eyes met his, and he nodded, his mouth pursing in a soft frown. He took the packet from Will's lap and slid it out from beneath the journal. His hands were steady when he pulled the sheaf of papers free, his movements slow and careful.
I thought there would be more,
he said, staring down at the sum of her, the lost Lady Murasaki. He offered the pages to Will, asking,
Will you read it to me? Not all of it, of course, just... You have such a pleasant voice. I think I could listen to anything coming from you.
Will's mouth curved in a soft smile, and he took the papers. Clearing his throat, he looked down at Chiyoh's neat, tiny handwriting and began to read. I have forsaken myself. I am a warrior no longer. I have cast off the armor of my father and exchanged it for a prostitute's robes. I must do what I can to survive. I have nothing. I own nothing. I belong nowhere, and I can never go home. My family's name is all I have left to remind me of who I am. I am Murasaki. I am Murasaki. I am Murasaki and will always be. In years past, I stepped over my father's dead body and led an army into war against foreign invaders. I have watched my ancestral home burn to the ground, every living creature within murdered. I have buried my sons and sold my armor for food that was as dust in my mouth. I have lost a child, saved another, and flung myself on strange shores to escape the death that waited patiently behind me. Like a fox spirit, I have wrapped myself in the trappings of humanity. I am Omega, soft and delicate to their condescending eyes. I pretend I do not hate them. I pretend I am weaker than they, and that is all they see. I have made a life for us. I have done what I have had to do to protect Chiyoh. Yet now I am afraid. Now I am afraid. After all these years, I have seen him again. The man who betrayed my father, the one who sat at our table and deceived us. I have seen him in the face of his son. I thought myself past anger. I thought myself past regret. Now I find I am merely a vessel for them. I am Murasaki, and I will have my revenge. I know I will not survive it. I know that when the time comes, this terrible rage will burn me to my soul. But he will burn alongside me. I will make sure of it. And so I commit my life to these pages from beginning to end. This is how I came to be so far from my home, passed like a plaything from king to king, from stage to stage, from bed to bed, while my angry heart screamed inside of me. I am Murasaki, and this is how I came to be. Will read on while he and Hannibal ate their modest little breakfast, the childhood of Lady Murasaki laid out in short, sharp sentences. There was a stark beauty in the way she wrote, all flourish stripped away for cold facts. In a world of city-states and power plays, she was raised not as a daughter, nor as a son, but as an Omega, a trained, hardened warrior, a God's-touched sliver of divinity on earth destined to command legions. She was still a child when the first foreigners finally reached her home, secure in her place and confident in her father's ability to protect them. They thought they had nothing to fear, and welcomed their guest into their hospitality, despite his appalling manners and inability to speak with any degree of propriety.
I was 12 years old that summer when he came, a tall and strange thing with eyes like a lion's. My father said he was lucky, even if he was unbecoming of an alpha male. He was soft and full of sadness, and would watch the setting sun with tears in his eyes.
Father pressed him to stay the night, but he stayed with us for years. The servants called him Shishi to tease him, but Roland was his name.
My gods,
Hannibal whispered, taking the page from Will.
Are you certain?
I can't imagine there was an error, Will said, leaning over to point to the place. See? What are the chances, Hannibal? Aunt Margaret said grandfather fled to Nippon after he fell out with Charles. Murasaki wrote that she was 12 when this man came. Going by the dates on her gravestone, that would have been right around the time grandfather was missing, wouldn't it? We should ask him.
Perhaps, but...
Mr. Hawks opened the door then, announcing with sonorous dignity,
Your guests have begun to descend, my lords. Should you like to join them? Thank you, Mr. Hawks,
Hannibal said, hastily stuffing the papers back into their packet. He smoothed his palms over his knees in a nervous gesture Will had rarely seen him display, his agitation slicing up through the bond like ozone after a lightning strike. He looked at Will and said,
We'll continue this later. Should I put this in my safe, or is there room enough in that famous jewelry box of yours?
I'll put it away, Will promised, taking it from him and sliding to his feet in tandem with his husband. And then I'll join you with our guests.
One crisis at a time,
Hannibal said, still trembling with shock. Hannibal, Will called, pausing him before he could stride away. He closed the distance between them and reached up with his free hand to cup his husband's high cheek. Those golden eyes gazed down at him, the eyes of a lion indeed, and some of his tension eased when Will placed a soft, tender kiss on his lips.
What was that for?
Hannibal whispered, his quivering tension running out of him, drained away by Will's kiss and the gentle understanding in his mate's bright blue eyes. I love you, Hannibal, Will told him, both answer and declaration. He kissed him again, pleased to feel his husband give slightly, relaxing to his touch. I love you very much, and we will get to the bottom of this, I can promise you that. Hannibal smiled, clasping Will's elbows in his hands for a light squeeze, and said,
Every time I hear you say that, it's as wonderful as the first time. Quickly now, say it again.
I love you, Hannibal Lecter, Will murmured, and sent him off with a parting kiss. Will found Hannibal and their guests in the drawing-room when he joined them after locking up the packet. His husband was with Uncle Robert and Lord Warrington, engaged in an animated conversation that showed a peak of the youth he'd once been. Will found himself watching his husband on his return, delighting in every quick grin and flash of alpha fangs, every quip that passed his fine lips. Yet he could taste Hannibal's desperation for lightness after the odd revelations of the morning, his driving need for normalcy and enjoyment that had nearly been robbed from them both with even so little from Lady Murasaki's journal. Will was glad it was locked up, and was determined it would stay that way until they had time to read the entirety.
Will, honestly,
Mina said, her voice sharp with irritation.
You might as well be in the next room.
Don't scold him, Aunt Aldona said, a fond smile curving her lips. She patted Mina's hand where they sat together, the other ladies in quiet conversation nearer the fireplace to chase away Aunt Margaret's constant chill. There is nothing wrong with being fascinated by one's husband, is there? Will blushed and turned his head away, clearing his throat as he settled across from them. His senses were keyed to his mate, every husky purr of his voice, every shift of his powerful body, every soft curl of his scent that drifted across the room was a torment to his attention. The Omega in him wanted nothing more than to coax Hannibal someplace private, tug his husband into his arms, and cradle him until they both were calm and content. It was a difficult impulse to ignore, and he knew it tugged at Hannibal just as much, by the way his amber eyes kept seeking his. Will's attention focused very sharply, however, when Aunt Aldona said, I was just admiring these. I noticed them in the other rooms of the house and wondered what their use. Will looked at what she held, shock blanking his mind when she turned the frame in her graceful hands to show a display of his hand-tied lures. "Where did you find those?" he asked, his voice thin, eyes wide. "Just here," Aunt Aldona said, gesturing at the table next to her. A quick scan of the room showed Will several more frames placed on other surfaces, all of them holding his handiwork. "Will, you are very pale. Is something the matter?"
"He's shocked, my lady,"
Mina said, sounding somewhat smug to Will's ears. She took the framed lures from Aunt Aldona and made a show of placing them on the table between their seats.
"I assure you, Will, I did everything in my power to dissuade Mr. Hawks from putting these ghastly things out all over the house."
"Ghastly?" Aunt Aldona echoed, muttering something beneath her breath. "They are not ghastly, but I confess I do not know what they are." Will recovered, irritation with Mina flushing his surprise away. He smiled at Aunt Aldona and said, "They are fishing lures. I craft them myself. Each one is unique, holding feathers and fibers from local wildlife." The small pique in his tension had drawn the assessing gaze of the other ladies, who drifted closer, half curious and half protective. "You made these, Will?" Bedelia asked, picking up the frame to look before Aunt Grace plucked it from her hands, raising her monocle to peer at them. "I saw some on display in the parlor last night. I wondered who had made them."
"Oh, Will makes all sorts of things," Mina said, her smile fraying beneath the arrival of Bedelia, who made no move to hide her dislike. "I did try, Will, I promise you. I told Mr. Hawks countless times that you would faint from mortification to have such things on display, that this is a private hobby of yours and you shouldn't like anyone staring at it. I questioned him quite sharply in how he came to have them even, but he insisted his lordship wished them to be placed all about the house."
"Did he now?" Will asked, casting a dangerous look over his shoulder at Hannibal, who immediately straightened his back as if he'd been scolded and managed to look deceptively innocent.
"He did. I told him you wished nothing of the sort," Mina carried on, nervously watching the frame make the rounds of the guests. "Who on earth would want to have such common items on display in the rooms of such a rich house?"
"My husband, apparently," Will said, a wry smile tugging his full lips as he thought of Hannibal sneaking his lures to Mr. Hawks. "I think they're quite beautiful, Lady Rathmore," Lady Warrington said, accepting the frame as it was passed to her and taking a closer look. "Dressed so becomingly in feathers and flying threads, slender and enticing, yet sharp enough to draw blood. You could start quite a rage with these law clodges."
"A rage?" Mina asked, uttering a delicate, floating little laugh. "For tying lures? Father always said—" "I believe the only person interested in the opinion of Lord Reddig," Aunt Margaret said with a sniff and a tap of her cane, "is no longer among us. And how was his departure, my dear?"
"Somewhat later than I would prefer, Aunt Margaret," Will said, suppressing a smile when she winked at him.
"Father has gone?"
Mina asked, her blue eyes flying to Will's.
"Gone?"
Will stood and took her hand, saying, "May we speak privately?" He tugged her away from their guest to the opposite corner near the door, whispering once they were out of earshot. "I sent him home this morning, Mina. I'm sorry you didn't get a chance to say goodbye."
"Sent him home? Will, how could you?" Mina hissed aghast.
She fanned herself with her hand, blinking away tears.
"After all of these years he visits you and you toss him out like a scrap."
"Mina, you saw for yourself how rudely he behaved," Will whispered, fishing out his handkerchief for her, watching as she dabbed her eyes in a pretty display of horrified sensibilities. "He was determined to make a fool of me, but wound up making one of himself instead."
"Oh, Will, honestly, he wanted to make up with you," she said, staring at him with reproach. "How could you be so cruel?"
"Cruel," Will echoed, the word escaping him on a snarling exhale. Before he could say more, Hannibal touched his elbow and murmured, "Will, grandfather wishes to see us." Mina tipped her chin up, stubborn and proud.
"I suppose you'd best be off then. Heavens, no, you shouldn't let your blood relatives come between you and your fairy tale life."
"Lady Rathmore, will you join us?" Hannibal offered, holding out his arm to her with such a hard look even Will shivered. Mina stared at his arm as if he'd offered her an asp to hold, her eyes dark with suspicion. "Please."
"May I ask what this is about?"
Mina inquired, slightly mollified, but making her upset known to her brother. She took Hannibal's arm grudgingly, both of them stiff with irritation.
There have been some changes to the legalities of Hertford House. Grandfather hoped you might stand as witness.
Her eyes narrowed then, and Will tensed in response, exhaling softly when Hannibal's free hand brushed down his arm in gentle caress.
"Why, Hannibal, dear,"
Mina said, holding Will's gaze with subtle victory shining in her blue eyes.
"there is nothing more I would love to witness than the fate of Hertford House."
Mr. Buddish was in Grandfather's suite when they arrived, along with Anthony Dimmond, who broke into a delighted smile when he set eyes on Will.
"And the morning just keeps getting more beautiful,"
he said, rising with his hands outstretched. Mina moved to take them, giggling.
"Oh, how you do go on, Lord du Maurier!"
"Anthony, stop flirting with Will,"
Grandfather ordered, taking the wind out of Mina's sails, much to Hannibal's satisfaction.
"I must reserve all flirtations for myself,"
Hannibal said, taking Will's hand up for a kiss, laying one on each finger, including the ring itself.
"You look somewhat less fatigued than I feared you would, Grandfather."
"Mr. Zeller's methods may be unorthodox, but they are certainly effective," Will said, all of them drawing nearer to the bed where Grandfather sat, propped up by pillows, watching them over the tops of his spectacles.
"If I am making an improvement, it is due to my own tenacity,"
Grandfather said, affronted, only to reluctantly admit.
"However, perhaps there was some good in all of his fussing."
"Fussing? That man is a shiftless layabout, who is never here when you need him, and always here when you don't want him. Where is he, by the way?"
"Not here, and precisely where I want him,"
Grandfather said, angling a hard, reproving look Hannibal's way.
"Now, down to business. Mr. Buddish has come to settle the matter of this addendum once and for all. Sit, all of you sit."
They did so, settling into chairs hastily brought to them by Jimmy, who tended Grandfather in Zeller's absence. "As you know, the copy of the addendum was not able to be traced," Mr. Buddish said, delving into his papers, still looking travel-worn and decidedly pressured, no doubt dragged from his promise of rest by Grandfather's summons. "I have the original here, however." He passed it to Hannibal, who gave it to Will, murmuring,
"Be sure of the date."
"That's quite enough out of you," Will whispered, but checked the date all the same, which confirmed what both Hannibal and Grandfather had told him. "Did Grandfather tell you there was a forgery, Mr. Buddish?" "He did, my lord," Mr. Buddish said, his words surprising both Mina and Anthony. "I took a look at it, and it is an outright forgery. Neither paper nor ink is such that we use in our business dealings, though the accompanying note was the one I had sent with the copy, so we can safely assume it has been taken."
"Who on earth would do such a thing? And more to the point, why?"
Anthony asked, declining a chance to look at the paper.
"Mason Verger is an expert forger, I've recently been informed,"
Hannibal said, carefully watching Mina, who only expressed bewilderment at the name.
"I cannot fathom how he may have gotten involved, or to what end, but it is too coincidental that he has slipped my huntsman, and we have forged documents muddying the waters."
"Huntsman? What an odd thing to say,"
Mina remarked, her brow furrowing.
"You hunt men like animals, Lord Clarges?"
"No, an associate of mine hunts dangerous beasts with other dangerous beasts,"
Hannibal corrected her, noting how she did not flinch from his words.
"He was unfortunately beset by something even more dangerous, and met an unfortunate end."
"Gods, how terrible," Anthony whispered, shaking his head.
"What would hunt a hunter?"
"It was a surprisingly similar end to the 2 officers we had followed by Mr. Dollarite," Will put in, angling a look at Mina. "Have you had any contact with him, Mina?"
"No, none. Not since I sent him away,"
she said, her voice almost shrill with annoyance.
"What are you implying?"
"Nothing is implied, Lady Rathmore,"
Grandfather said, attempting to soothe her nerves.
"It would be of great help and interest to us if we could locate your Mr. Dollarite and see where he fits in all of this. That is all. We rely on your help, my dear, now more than ever."
"I know nothing of him,"
she said, hands clenched together in her lap, cheeks pink with a flush.
"You make it sound as if I'm involved."
"Involved in what, precisely?"
Hannibal murmured, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. Her tension raised the fine hairs on his nape, and Will tightened next to him, as if she teetered on the verge of a confession. Mina fidgeted, twisting the fabric of her gown in her fingers. She would not look at any of them when she whispered,
"In an affair."
Will's shoulders fell on a subtle sigh, his suspicions certainly subsiding beneath a wash of relief. Hannibal, however, only stared at her a moment longer, the 3 other lector men taking her measure with weighty consideration.
"This is terribly embarrassing,"
Mina said, tears warbling in her voice. She pressed Will's handkerchief to her face, blocking her expression behind snowy linen.
"May I please be excused, Your Grace?"
No, my dear, you agreed to be a witness, and I will hold you to it,
Grandfather said, signaling Mr. Buddish.
You read the addendum regarding Hertford House. I want to be sure that your mind, as well as Will's and my own, is put to rest on the matter.
This is the new settlement for Hertford House,
Mr. Buddish said, passing the documents that Hannibal had brought to Will, and Will had subsequently altered.
I've made up a copy, which you all will sign and date in addition to the original. The copy will be left for you, Your Grace, while the original will return with me to be filed.
Will passed one to Mina and the other to Anthony. Mina's snuffle died down abruptly as she read in silence, her eyes flicking over the words with sharp attention. Anthony, however, only skimmed enough to satisfy Grandfather, and said,
"This seems all in order."
"You would be a trustee?"
Mina asked, holding the paper in both hands, blue eyes moiling and shocked.
"Hertford House would no longer be yours, Will."
"No, it is officially part of the inheritance now," Will said, reaching over to pat her shoulder. "Hertford House will go to Hannibal's heir, and I will be the steward, so to speak, until our son is grown enough to take control in my stead."
"This seems very irregular,"
she whispered, leaning close to him to hiss.
"You would let him get away with this, Will, you—"
"It is done, Mina," Will said, cutting her off, impatient with her continued attempts to champion an irrelevant cause. "Sign the paper. It is official. You know I never intended to keep control of Hertford House. It belongs to the Lectors." She sat back with a glower, whispered with mulish irritation.
"Well, it does now. I suppose you've no choice in the matter."
Mina,
if you are afraid that your brother will be left with nothing to show for his time here, then these should put you at ease,"
Grandfather said, handing over the packet of Hannibal's assets and his instructions for Will's fortunes as well as Roland's own.
"Anthony, you're familiar with my wishes, I believe."
"Yes, Grandfather," Anthony said, waving a dismissive hand. "Father informed us of all your intentions in case anything should happen to him."
Mina shuffled the papers, her eyes growing wider and more incredulous by the second.
"In the event of Hannibal's death, you not only hold Hertford in trust along with the heir's portion,"
she squeaked, lifting one paper like an accusation,
"but you are also endowed with this?"
"Most of that applies while I'm still alive," Hannibal corrected her, his smile wolfish when he added, "I didn't want to give him too much incentive to pack me back off to the front."
"Hannibal," Will scolded, angling a repressive look at him. "He's right, Mina. I'm well looked after. I know you were very worried I would somehow come to harm, that they would see me stripped of everything and turned out, without a future or any prospects, but surely this puts your mind to rest?"
"Yes,"
she said, the word a small breath. She was pale and stunned, as if Will had given her a death sentence rather than the entitlements set out for him.
"Yes, Will, darling. My mind is most certainly at rest."
The papers were signed and dated by Mina, Anthony, as well as Grandfather and Mr. Buddish. The originals were packed into Mr. Buddish's briefcase and locked up tight before the man was finally allowed to take advantage of the hospitality Will had attempted to grant him. With the paperwork signing safely out of the way, Grandfather was more than happy to dismiss the lot of them to their own devices so he could nap, despite Will's attempts to speak with him in private about the journal.
"Well, that was exciting,"
Anthony remarked, patting his pocket for a cigarette case and dropping his hand with a sheepish grin when Hannibal raised an eyebrow at him.
"I'll just take a turn around the gardens, shall I? Lady Rathmore, would you care to join me? I believe Freddie is enjoying the fresh air. We could find her and surprise her. She'll have to be outside to get air enough around you windbag," Hannibal said, wincing at the jab in the ribs Will gave him.
"I beg your pardon, but I must go to my room,"
Mina said, fragile and distraught.
"Please excuse me."
"Mina, are you unwell?"
"A small headache, my dear. Nothing to worry yourself over,"
she said, hastening up the stairs. "I'll have Miss Speck bring up some headache powder," Will called, but predictably received no reply. Aren't you glad I married the wrong one? Anthony asked, grinning at Hannibal's expression of vast relief. Keep it up and you can stay out in the garden, Will warned, taking a glance around. Have you seen Winston?
Not since Mrs. Henderson took him downstairs,
Hannibal said, walking them slowly toward the sitting room where Mr. Hawks was on watch.
Hawks, was Winston brought back in? He was, my lord. Lady Mishkinish has taken a fancy to him, my lord. He has accompanied her to the gallery.
Thank you, Mr. Hawks. I'll go collect him, Will said, moving back down the hall. And could you ask Miss Speck to check on Mina, please? She has a headache and might need something for it.
I'll come with you,
Hannibal offered, pausing when Will called back. Have a walk, Anthony. I'll join you in a moment and we can go visit Peter.
Excellent plan, Anthony said, delighted. I've been hoping to see those dogs my valet caught sight of. He said they're simply massive.
The discussion grew faint behind him as Will made his way to the massive gallery that housed the portraits of Hartford's prior inhabitants. He found Lady Mishkinish standing before the portrait of Saule Lecter, her long skirts trailing out a pace behind her, Winston sitting attentively at her side. Will made a gesture that stayed him when Winston turned, indicating he should stay where he was, and Winston settled for a soft woof of greeting. I can hardly believe she's been gone for so long, Aunt Aldona sighed. Saule Lecter gazed out from her portrait, captured forever in the bloom of her youth, a beautiful enchantress with dark hair and sparkling eyes, and a smiling mouth that seemed to promise secrets eternally on the verge of being shared. I never got to say good-bye to her. None of us did. We expected such happy news, the birth of a new baby, little piece of her passed on in the world. Instead, we were told she had died. Will came to a stop at her side, her perfume teasing his nose. It still stung his senses, but not as painfully, and his stomach had little to threaten him with in retaliation for his discomfort. That must have been very difficult for you and your family, Will said, bending a little to pat Winston's head and settle him. He straightened, looking up at the portrait and considering silence before saying, It must be a great comfort for you to see her face again, if only in a portrait. Yes, it is, Aldona said, a smile chasing away her sombre reserve. She filled the world with warmth like the sun herself, our Saule. That is what she was named for, did you know? I am sadly uneducated in your native tongue, my lady. It is a mistake I intend to rectify, however, as Hannibal is fluent. I am sure your husband would be happy to teach you, she said, her mouth curved up at one corner, a wicked gleam lighting her eyes. Though it might not be useful outside of the bed you share. Will blushed, a surprised laugh escaping him before he could stop. Look at you blush, you pretty child, Aldona said, reaching up to lay her cool palm against his flushed cheek with a soft, weary sigh. I wish she had met you. Will averted his gaze, uncertain how to respond, but the motherless child in him warmed to her in a way that he didn't expect, and he leaned into her touch just a fraction. I wish I had met her too, he said, taking a soft breath when her hand dropped from his face, but she grasped his hand and held it, her fingers cold and firm in his own. Her death left an emptiness that filled with sorrow and despair. Sorrowness, emptiness, and despair, Aunt Aldona whispered, her voice pleasantly low and soft. A frown pulled her features tight when she glanced at where Cyrus's portrait should have hung. She seemed so pensive and thoughtful that Will shifted at her side, turning to settle his other hand around hers, and closing it in both of his in silent comfort. Cyrus visited us just after Saule died. Did his grace tell you? Aunt Aldona asked, and when Will shook his head, she murmured, Perhaps he didn't know. Cyrus was in such a terrible state, feverish, speaking nonsense. I was very glad only Thomas and I could understand him. He would have given our mother and father such a fright, and just after learning of our Saule's death. He must have been inconsolable, Will whispered, thinking of the inscription in his ring with a soft pang of regret for the pain Hannibal's parents had endured. They seemed very deeply in love. He was mad with grief, she said, her thumb rubbing over Will's ring with tender regard. They brought him on a litter from a ship, he was so ill. He fell in and out of fever, saying such frightening things. He said he wished he'd brought Hannibal to live with us. I tried to excuse it as the fever speaking, but not everything that was said could be excused. Perhaps he wanted to share the last part of her that was left, Will softly offered, trying, always trying, to find the potential for reason in the unreasonable. He was sick, Aldona said, shaking her head. It was more than grief in whatever struck him down on the ship. Cyrus was ill. He spoke of flinging himself into the river and forcing his father to start all over again. When I reminded him that he had a reason to live in Hannibal, Saul's legacy to protect, he shouted at me that Hannibal was not his son. Will frowned, the little pieces of what Hannibal had ever said about Cyrus coalescing in his memory. I've never been so deeply offended in all my life. It was absolutely absurd, of course, Aunt Aldona said, shaking her head with a sorrowful sigh. Even had I doubted Saule, which I would sooner expect the sun not to rise than for her to ever bend a vow, Hannibal is the very image of his father. He certainly is, Will murmured, thinking of Videlia's story and the animosity that had existed between Cyrus and Roland without any seeming cause, coming to a head when Hannibal was named the heir in Cyrus's place. How enraging that must have been had Cyrus still believed Hannibal was not his son. No matter how I plied him, how I asked, he would not say it again, would tell me why he thought such a terrible thing, Aunt Aldona said, angling an irritated look at the empty place where his portrait had once hung, needing a focus for her mute anger. Even he must have seen for himself Hannibal is a lector through and through. Have you ever asked grandfather? Will asked, wondering if the falling out between Cyrus and Roland had occurred over Hannibal's paternity. Roland would never accept any child who was not of direct lector stock into the line of inheritance he knew. If there had been any hint of anything unseemly, he would have known. He said it was nonsense, nothing more than the feverish ramblings of a sick man. He had no reason to doubt Saul's fidelity, and neither did Cyrus, Aunt Aldona said, her fingers rubbing Will in a soft squeeze. Had Saul not died bringing his son into this world, Cyrus's doubt surely would have killed her. She loved him more than anything, and until that moment I thought he had loved her just as madly. Only those we love can deal us wounds we cannot heal from, Will said, smiling slightly when Winston heaved over against his leg with a soft whine. They were very happy once and very much in love. It is all so far in the past now, she murmured, reaching up to touch the frame with her fingertips. I wonder how I can still recall it so clearly. Would you tell me about her? And of Hannibal as a child? Will asked, his curiosity getting the better of him, his tender heart hoping to lighten her mood with recollections of better days. Perhaps we could walk in the garden. It is too beautiful a day to stay inside. She looked over at him, lips curving into a smile. She slipped her hand free and looped her arm through his, saying, I have been hoping you would ask.